May 27th, 1940. The sleepy hamlet of L'Épinette, France. A thick, unnatural silence hangs over the cobbled road, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of German jackboots marching closer. Captain Jack Churchill crouches in the hayloft of a small barn, the wood creaking softly under his weight as he peers through a narrow slat. Sweat trickles down his temple, but his hands are steady, gripping not a Lee Enfield rifle, but the leather-wrapped handle of a massive yew longbow. Below him, the men of the Manchester Regiment wait with bated breath, their eyes fixed on their eccentric commander, wondering if this madness will actually work against the Wehrmacht machine. The atmosphere inside the ambush site is electric, with suppressed fear and confusion among the British ranks. They are the rear guard, tasked with holding the line while thousands of their comrades flee toward the beaches of Dunkirk. Most officers are frantically checking maps or radioing for artillery support that will never arrive. But Churchill is different. He has spent the last few weeks riding his military motorcycle with a bow strapped to his back and a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword at his hip. To the terrified conscripts huddling in the ditches, he looks like a ghost from Agincourt who has stumbled into the wrong century. Yet his supreme confidence offers a strange, jagged kind of comfort. Through the haze of the morning mist, the silhouette of the German patrol finally emerges around the bend of the road. 5 soldiers walk point, their Mauser rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Unaware that they are walking into a trap set by a man who regards gunpowder as an ungentlemanly innovation, Churchill tracks the lead soldier, a Feldwebel causing the gravel to crunch under his boots. The range is barely 30 yards. Slowly, methodically, Jack draws the string of his longbow back to his cheek. The tension in the wood groans almost imperceptibly, a primitive sound that stands in stark contrast to the mechanical purr of the approaching German trucks behind the infantry screen. Time seems to suspend in the cool French air as Churchill releases his breath and the string simultaneously. The arrow flies with a sharp hiss, slicing through the space between the barn and the road in a fraction of a second. It strikes the German sergeant squarely in the chest with a wet, sickening thud that echoes louder than a gunshot in the quiet morning. The man looks down in absolute bewilderment at the feathered shaft protruding from his uniform before collapsing onto the cobblestones. It is a moment of pure anachronism, likely the only time in the entire Second World War that a British soldier will fell an enemy with a medieval longbow. The signal has been given, and the hesitation of the British troops vanishes instantly as they open fire with Bren guns and rifles. The sudden roar of automatic weapons tears through the confusion of the German column, which is still processing the sight of their leader killed by an arrow. Churchill abandons his bow and draws his broadsword, leaping from his concealed position to direct the fire of his men. The clash is chaotic and brutal, a desperate delaying action fought with the ferocity of men who know the sea is their only escape. In the center of the storm stands Jack, barking orders and moving with an eerie calm that suggests he is enjoying the carnage. As the skirmish concludes and the German main force begins to bring mortar fire onto the village, the reality of the strategic situation sets in. This small victory is just a momentary pause in the inevitable collapse of the Allied defense in France. Churchill rallies his company, ensuring their withdrawal is orderly rather than a rout. They move through the hedgerows and back roads, constantly harried by the Luftwaffe overhead. The Stuka dive bombers scream down like banshees, strafing the columns of refugees and soldiers alike. Amidst the smoke and the wreckage of burning vehicles, Churchill marches on, his sword swinging at his hip, a symbol of defiance against the technological terror raining from the sky. The retreat to the coast is a grueling test of endurance that strips away the veneer of civilization. Roads are clogged with displaced civilians, pushing carts piled high with their worldly possessions, their faces gaunt with despair. The Manchester Regiment must navigate this river of human misery while maintaining a defensive perimeter against the pursuing German panzers. Jack Churchill moves up and down the line, his presence acting as a stabilizing force. He refuses to show fatigue, often walking the most dangerous flanks himself. He treats the war not as a tragedy, but as a sporting challenge, an attitude that bewilders his superiors but keeps his men from succumbing to panic. Nightfall brings no relief, as the horizon is lit by the glow of burning villages and the flashes of distant artillery. During these dark hours, Churchill's leadership style becomes even more pronounced. While other units are tossing away heavy equipment to lighten their loads, he insists on maintaining discipline and combat readiness. He creates makeshift roadblocks and sets minor ambushes to slow the German advance, buying precious minutes for the main body of the army to reach the extraction point. His broadsword, which many initially viewed as an affectation, becomes a rallying point, a gleaming piece of steel that reflects the moonlight and the unyielding spirit of its bearer. Finally, the terrain flattens, and the scent of salt water mixes with the acrid smell of cordite. They have reached the perimeter of Dunkirk. The scene that greets them is one of apocalyptic scale. Hundreds of thousands of men are lined up in snaking columns across the vast stretches of sand, waiting for the Royal Navy or the civilian flotilla to rescue them. The smoke from burning oil refineries turns the day into a twilight gloom, and the beach is littered with abandoned trucks, helmets, and rifles. It is a graveyard of the British Expeditionary Force's material strength, a visual representation of a catastrophic defeat. Yet, amidst this landscape of surrender and loss, Jack Churchill remains armed and composed. He leads his men onto the dunes, finding a place in the queue for the boats. While they wait, exposed to the constant threat of aerial bombardment, he does not cower. Witnesses later recall seeing an officer marching along the water's edge with a bow and arrow, seemingly unbothered by the Messerschmitts strafing the sand. He views the chaos around him with a critical, tactical eye, already thinking about how the British Army must adapt if it is to ever return to the continent. The wait is agonizing, stretching into hours and then days, as the little ships ferry men out to the destroyers waiting in deep water. When the time finally comes to board a vessel, the evacuation is frantic. Men wade chest-deep into the freezing water, hauling themselves over the gunwales of fishing boats and pleasure yachts. Churchill ensures his men are aboard before he climbs up himself. He brings his full kit with him, refusing to leave his weapons for the enemy as trophies. As the boat pulls away from the French coast, the rumble of artillery fades into the distance, replaced by the slapping of waves against the hull. Jack looks back at the burning shoreline, his face set in a grim expression. He knows this is not the end of the war, but merely the end of the beginning. The crossing of the English Channel is a sombre affair. The soldiers are exhausted, demoralized, and grateful just to be alive. But inside Jack Churchill, a fire is burning. He is angry at the defensive nature of the campaign, frustrated by the lack of aggression shown by the Allied command. He believes that the Germans are not invincible, that they can be beaten if one is willing to fight with enough ferocity and unorthodox tactics. As the white cliffs of Dover come into view, he is already formulating plans, dreaming of a way to take the fight back to the enemy on his own terms. Upon landing in England, the reality of the situation hits the public. The country is under threat of immediate invasion. The army is in disarray, lacking heavy weapons and transport. Yet, amidst the national anxiety, Churchill's eccentricities continue to manifest. A famous anecdote from this period captures his spirit perfectly. While riding his motorcycle through the blackened streets of London during a blackout, he is stopped by a curious police constable who asks about the strange contraption on his bike. It is his longbow, strapped securely for immediate use. Jack explains to the baffled officer that in a war of such scale, a man must always be prepared to engage the enemy silently, regardless of the technological era. The British High Command, realizing that a static defense will not win the war, begins to look for a new kind of soldier. Prime Minister Winston Churchill calls for the creation of a force of hunter-class troops to rain terror along the enemy's occupied coastline. They need men who are independent, aggressive, and willing to operate behind enemy lines. Jack Churchill hears rumours of this new special service brigade, simply called the Commandos. The description appeals to his romanticised view of warfare night raids, sabotage, and close-quarters combat. It is the perfect antidote to the frustration of Dunkirk. He volunteers immediately, leaving the regular infantry behind without a backward glance. He is transferred to the rugged terrain of Scotland for assessment and training. This landscape, with its mist-covered mountains and freezing lochs, suits his temperament perfectly. It is here that he will shed the last constraints of a conventional officer and fully embrace his persona as Mad Jack. The retreat is over. The time for raiding has begun. He prepares himself to forge a unit that reflects his own warrior ethos. Ready to carry the sword back to Europe, the mist-shrouded highlands of Scotland provide the perfect backdrop for the birth of a new breed of soldier. Following the humiliation at Dunkirk, the British military establishment acknowledges that traditional infantry tactics are insufficient for the kind of coastal raiding required to harass the German occupiers. In the rugged terrain surrounding Achnacarry, volunteers from across the armed forces gather to undergo a punishing regimen designed to break all but the most resilient. Jack Churchill thrives in this environment, finding a spiritual home among the granite peaks and freezing lochs. He views the commando training not merely as physical conditioning, but as a return to a primal form of warriorhood that has been lost in the age of mechanization. Among the ranks of No. 3 Commando, stories of Churchill's eccentricities begin to circulate with the speed of wildfire. He is often seen leading training exercises while playing the bagpipes, an instrument he mastered largely to annoy his fellow officers during peacetime. While others focus on the intricate mechanics of the Bren gun or the Thompson submachine gun, Jack spends his evenings sharpening the edge of his basket-hilted claymore. He loudly proclaims to anyone within earshot that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. This is not bluster. It is a deeply held conviction that the psychological impact of a blade outweighs the utility of a sidearm. By late 1941, the newly formed commando units are ready for their first major test, Operation Archery. The objective is the German-occupied port of Vågsøy in Norway, a critical hub for the production of fish oil, which the Nazis used to manufacture high explosives. The plan calls for a complex, multi-pronged assault involving the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. But the spearhead will be the commandos. For Churchill, now second in command of No. 3 Commando, this is the opportunity he has been craving. It is a chance to prove that a small force of highly motivated shock troops can inflict disproportionate damage on the enemy's fortress. On Christmas Day, the raiding force sets sail from the Scapa Flow, navigating the treacherous waters of the North Sea. The journey is rough, battered by winter gales that toss the transport ships like toys, leaving many of the men debilitatingly seasick. Jack Churchill, however, remains immune to the misery, his focus entirely on the upcoming violence. As the flotilla approaches the Norwegian coast on the morning of December 27th, the weather miraculously clears. The heavy cruiser HMS Kenya leads the way, her guns silent but ready to unleash hell upon the coastal batteries, protecting the fjord. The silence is heavy, filled with the collective breath of hundreds of men preparing to die. Inside the landing craft assault designated for the first wave, the smell of diesel fumes and nervous sweat is overpowering. The soldiers check their weapons one last time, clicking magazines into place and tightening their helmet straps. At the front of the vessel stands Jack Churchill, a figure of striking defiance against the grey dawn. He is not crouching or seeking cover. Instead, he stands fully upright in the prow, wearing his kilt and clutching his bagpipes. As the shoreline of Marloy Island comes into view, the German defences wake up, and tracers begin to arc through the air toward the approaching boats. The ramp of the landing craft drops into the icy surf, and the moment transforms into legend before a single shot is fired by his men. Churchill fills his lungs and begins to play March of the Cameron Men. The shrill, piercing sound of the pipes cuts through the roar of the boat engines and the crack of enemy rifle fire. It is a surreal, terrifying noise to the German defenders, who are expecting a stealthy approach or a barrage of gunfire, not a musical performance. Churchill steps off the ramp, the water swirling around his boots, and finishes the tune before tossing the pipes onto the sand and drawing his sword. With a roar that rivals the explosions beginning to tear apart the German bunkers, Jack leads the charge up the beach. He holds his sword high in one hand and a grenade in the other, a terrifying berserker straight out of a Highland nightmare. The psychological effect on the enemy is immediate and devastating. The German soldiers manning the coastal gun battery are well-trained professionals, but nothing in the Wehrmacht manual has prepared them for a sword-wielding madman leading a pack of commandos. Panic ripples through their lines as the British troops, emboldened by their leader's insanity, storm the positions with ferocious aggression. The battle for Marloy Island is brief but intense. Churchill moves through the trenches and bunkers with a fluidity that belies the chaos around him. He uses his sword to signal targets and direct the flow of his men, treating the battlefield like an orchestra he is conducting. The commandos clear the gun emplacements with grenades and bayonets, neutralizing the threat to the Royal Navy ships offshore. Within minutes, the primary objective of the first wave is secured, and the Union Jack is hoisted over the German command post. Jack stands amidst the smoke, wiping the grime from his face, his blood pumping with the thrill of the fight. Meanwhile, across the water in the town of South WWII, the main body of the raid is turning into a vicious house-to-house brawl. Snipers are positioned in the windows of the wooden buildings, and machine gun nests cover the narrow streets. Churchill, having secured the island battery, crosses the water to join the fight in the town. The noise is deafening as demolition teams set charges on the fish oil factories, sending massive plumes of black smoke into the cold winter sky. The air is thick with the smell of burning timber and explosives, a chaotic sensory overload that disorients the defenders. Jack moves through the burning town with his characteristic swagger, unfazed by the sniper fire pinging off the cobblestones near his feet. He coordinates the demolition teams, ensuring the factories are thoroughly destroyed. At one point, a German mortar round lands dangerously close, showering him with debris. He merely brushes the dust off his uniform and continues to issue orders. His presence acts as a talisman for the younger soldiers. If the major can walk through fire with nothing but a sword, surely they can survive with their rifles. He embodies the offensive spirit that the British public is so desperate to see. The raid is not just about destruction, it is also about intelligence and prisoners. The commandos round up German soldiers and Norwegian collaborators, known as Quislings. Churchill takes a particular interest in the capture of documents from the local headquarters. He personally inspects the prisoners, his sword sheathed, but his hand resting ominously on the hilt. The Germans stare at him with a mixture of fear and confusion, unable to reconcile this archaic warrior with the modern war they are fighting. To them, he is a barbarian. To his men, he is a god of war. As the afternoon wears on, the signal for withdrawal is given. The commandos have achieved all their objectives, the guns are silenced, the factories are burning, and the German garrison has been decimated. The retreat to the landing craft is orderly, covered by a smoke screen and the guns of the HMS Kenya. Churchill is one of the last to leave the shore, ensuring that his men and the prisoners are safely aboard. He retrieves his bagpipes from the sand on Marloy, treating them with the same reverence one might show a fallen comrade. They have served their purpose, announcing the return of the British to the continent. The journey back to Scapa Flow is a celebration. The raid is a resounding success, a much-needed victory in a time of darkness. The press seizes upon the story. And while the official reports are somewhat sanitized, the legend of the officer with the sword and bagpipes begins to leak out. Jack Churchill does not care for the fame. He cares only that the enemy has been bled. He sits in the mess hall of the transport ship, cleaning his equipment. The salt water has stained the leather of his scabbard, and his kilt is torn, but his spirit is soaring. Operation Archery proves that the Fortress Europe is not impenetrable. It validates the commando concept and solidifies Jack Churchill's reputation as a man who operates on a different plane of existence. His superiors, who once viewed him as a dangerous eccentric, now see him as a vital asset. He has proven that in the chaos of combat, morale and audacity are weapons as potent as any artillery shell. As he looks out at the grey waters of the North Sea, he knows that this was just a raid. The real invasion, the true test of his steel, is yet to come. The success at WWII brings with it a promotion and a new assignment. Jack is to take command of No. 2 Commando. This means more responsibility, more men under his care, and more complex missions. He accepts the challenge with his usual stoicism. He knows that the war will only get harder, the battles bloodier. He sharpens his claymore again. The scraping of the whetstone, a rhythmic promise of violence. The shores of Norway were cold, but the fires of Italy await, where the ancient history of his weapon will find a fitting stage among the ruins of the Mediterranean. September 9th, 1943. The Gulf of Salerno, Italy. The Mediterranean dawn is shattered by the thunder of naval gunfire as the Allies launch Operation Avalanche. The invasion of the Italian mainland. A massive armada fills the horizon. But the element of surprise has been lost, and the German 10th Army is waiting in the hills overlooking the bay. In the lead landing craft, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill stands ready, his silhouette framed against the smoke and the erupting geysers of water. He is now commanding No. 2 Commando, a unit tasked with one of the most dangerous assignments of the invasion, seizing the coastal town of Vietri-sul-Mare and securing the vital mountain pass leading to Naples. The ramp drops, and the commandos surge into the surf, instantly met by a hail of machine gun fire and mortar shells. The beach is a chaotic killing zone, but Churchill moves with a terrifying purpose, urging his men forward off the exposed sand and into the cover of the tree line. Unlike the hit-and-run raid in Norway, this is a full-scale invasion against hardened panzer grenadiers who have had days to prepare their defences. Jack is armed with his trusty claymore, a weapon that seems ludicrously out of place amidst the modern carnage. Yet his men rally around the sight of the gleaming steel. They push through the town of Vietri, engaging in vicious street fighting to clear the buildings room by room. By nightfall, the commandos have secured the town, but the real challenge lies ahead in the rugged hills that dominate the landscape. The Germans still hold the high ground, particularly the village of Pigoletti, from which they are raining mortar fire down on the Allied bridgehead. The situation is precarious. If the commandos cannot hold the La Molina Pass, the German armour will pour through and drive the invasion force back into the sea. Churchill establishes his headquarters in a captured convent, but he is too restless to sit behind a desk while the enemy lurks in the darkness just a few hundred yards away. The night of September 13th is pitch black, the moon obscured by heavy clouds and the smoke of battle. The fighting has devolved into a stalemate of sniper fire and probing patrols. Most commanders would order their men to dig in and wait for daylight. But Jack Churchill operates on a different logic. He decides that the best defence is an aggressive offence. Grabbing his claymore and slinging a carbine over his shoulder, he calls for Corporal Ruffel, a stout and reliable soldier, to accompany him on a recce. It is a euphemism. Jack intends to go hunting, and he plans to do it quietly. The two men creep out of the British perimeter and into the terrifying no-man's land of the Dragoni Valley. The terrain is a nightmare of steep terraces, vineyards, and dense scrub, perfect for ambushes. They move silently, the sound of their boots muffled by the soft earth. Churchill takes the lead, his sword drawn, his senses tuned to the slightest rustle of leaves or the click of a bolt. They spot the glow of a cigarette in the distance. A careless mistake by a German sentry. Jack signals Ruffel to hold back while he advances alone, merging with the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. Churchill approaches the sentry post from the rear, moving with agonizing slowness. The German soldier is paired with another man, both manning a machine gun pit that overlooks the commando lines. They are whispering, distracted by the fatigue of war. In a blur of motion, Jack steps out of the darkness, the blade of his claymore reflecting the faint starlight. He places the tip of the sword against the neck of the nearest soldier and hisses a single, terrifying command, Hände hoch. The sheer shock of seeing a British officer wielding a medieval sword freezes the Germans in place. Their training has prepared them for grenades and bayonets, not this ghostly apparition. Disarming the two men, Churchill hands them over to Corporal Ruffel, but he is not finished. He realizes that the German defensive line is strung out along the terrace, a series of isolated posts that are unaware of each other's status. He formulates a plan that is as brilliant as it is insane. He forces one of the captured prisoners to walk ahead of him back toward the enemy lines. He tells the terrifyingly compliant German to call out to his comrades in the next post, assuring them that everything is fine. It is a psychological masterstroke, exploiting the confusion and fear that permeate the battlefield at night. As they approach the next machine gun nest, the prisoner calls out as instructed. The sentries in the pit relax, thinking their relief has arrived or that it is a friendly patrol. Churchill lunges out of the gloom again, his sword leading the way. The Germans, caught completely off guard and seeing their comrade already surrendered, drop their weapons without firing a shot. Ruffel rushes up to secure the new prisoners, adding them to the growing column. They are now managing a group of hostile soldiers that outnumbers them 3-1. Yet the Germans are cowed by the sheer audacity of the Englishman with the sword. The process repeats itself with mechanical efficiency. Churchill moves from post to post, clearing the entire terrace, one foxhole at a time. It is a high-wire act, a single shout, a single trigger pull, and the two commandos would be cut down instantly. But Jack's confidence is infectious, and the Germans are paralyzed by the uncertainty of the situation. They assume that they are being surrounded by a much larger force. They cannot conceive that their entire flank is being rolled up by one officer and one corporal. By the time they reach the end of the line, the catch has grown to ridiculous proportions. The final prize is a mortar crew, the very unit that has been tormenting the beachhead all day. They are located in a small depression, busily preparing rounds for a night barrage. Churchill descends upon them like a wrathful spirit. When the crew commander looks up to see the claymore inches from his face, the will to fight evaporates. They surrender their weapon and join the line of captives. Jack has now completely dismantled a significant portion of the German defensive perimeter without firing a single shot, relying entirely on stealth, nerve, and the primal fear induced by cold steel. The march back to the commando lines is a surreal procession. Jack Churchill leads the way, his sword sheathed now, smoking a cigarette with the casual air of a man walking his dog. Behind him shuffles a column of 42 German prisoners, stripped of their weapons and their dignity. Corporal Ruffle brings up the rear, his Thompson submachine gun trained on the group, his face a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They navigate the treacherous terrain back toward the convent, passing the bodies of those killed in the earlier fighting, a grim reminder of the fate these prisoners have narrowly avoided. As they approach the British sentries, a challenge rings out from the darkness. Churchill answers with his characteristic drawl, identifying himself and his guests. The sentries stare in open-mouthed wonder as the column emerges into the light of the perimeter flares. Men wake their comrades to see the spectacle. The prisoners are herded into a holding pen, where they sit in huddled groups, looking bewildered. When interrogated, they struggle to explain how they were captured. To admit that they were taken by a man with a sword is a humiliation that many of them will carry for the rest of their lives. The captured weapons and the mortar are brought in, a tangible bounty that proves the success of the mission. The immediate threat to the commando sector is significantly reduced, allowing the exhausted troops to rest for a few hours. Churchill's commanding officer is stunned by the report. The capture of 42 prisoners by 2 men is a feat that defies military logic. It is the kind of story that usually belongs in the pages of fiction. Yet here are the Germans, flesh and blood, sitting in the courtyard of the convent. Jack dismisses the praise, viewing it simply as a practical solution to a tactical problem. This action at Pigoletti cements Churchill's reputation not just as a brave soldier, but as a master of psychological warfare. He understands that soldiers are human beings, subject to fear and confusion, and that the unexpected can be more lethal than a barrage of artillery. He knows that the sight of a sword triggers an ancestral fear that modern training suppresses but cannot eliminate. By tapping into this, he is able to achieve results that a standard infantry assault would have paid for in blood. The prisoners are shipped to the rear, leaving behind a story that will spread through both the Allied and Axis ranks. However, the battle for Salerno is far from over. The Germans are regrouping, massing their panzer divisions for a counterattack that threatens to split the Allied armies. The commandos are ordered to hold their ground at all costs. The hills around the Dragoni Valley will soon become the scene of some of the most ferocious fighting of the Italian campaign. Jack cleans his sword, knowing that the easy part is over. The element of surprise is gone. The enemy now knows that there is a madman in the hills, and the next time they meet, they will not be so easily cowed. As the sun rises over the bruised landscape of Italy, Jack looks up at the towering peaks of the Apennines. The path to Naples is still blocked, and the valleys are swarming with the enemy. He checks his equipment, ensuring his longbow is also ready. Though he used the sword this night, the war is entering a darker, grittier phase. The romanticism of the raid is replaced by the grind of attrition. But as long as he stands, and as long as he holds his blade, the men of No. 2 Commando believe they are invincible. The legend of Mad Jack is fully forged. Now it must survive the fire. The capture of the prisoner column at Pigoletti is a momentary triumph in a campaign that is rapidly descending into a brutal war of attrition. The Dragone Valley, a steep and treacherous ravine cutting through the hills above Salerno, becomes the focal point of the German counterattack. No. 2. Commando is tasked with holding the high ground, specifically a rugged prominence known as Point 677. From this vantage point, they protect the fragile Allied beachhead from being overrun by the panzer divisions massing in the valley below. The sun beats down on the limestone rocks during the day, baking the men in their shallow foxholes, while the nights bring a chilling drop in temperature and the terrifying uncertainty of infiltration. Jack Churchill understands that sitting static in defensive positions is a death sentence for light infantry facing heavy armor and artillery. He knows that if the Germans are allowed to dictate the tempo of the battle, his men will be pulverized by mortar fire without ever seeing their enemy. To counter this, he institutes a doctrine of aggressive defense that borders on the suicidal. He orders his troops to dominate the darkness, turning the night, usually the terrifying domain of the attacker, into a weapon for the commandos. As soon as the sun dips below the horizon, the British positions do not go quiet. Instead, they come alive with a predatory energy. Small hunter-killer teams, their faces blackened with burnt cork and boot polish, slip out of the perimeter and into the scrub. Their orders are not just to gather intelligence, but to harass, confuse, and terrorize the German lines. Churchill orchestrates these raids like a conductor, sending squads to strike from unexpected angles, fire a few bursts of Thompson submachine gun fire, throw grenades, and then vanish before the enemy can return fire. The goal is to create a sense of paranoia among the German troops, making them believe that the hills are swarming with an army of ghosts who can strike anywhere at any time. The psychological impact of these tactics is profound. The German infantry, already on edge from the constant naval bombardment, begin to dread the sunset. Every rustle of the wind in the vineyards, every falling rock, sounds like a commando with a knife. Churchill exacerbates this fear by ordering his men to employ noise as a weapon. During firefights, he instructs them to shout, scream, and hurl insults in a cacophony of aggression. To the Germans listening in the dark, it sounds as though they are facing a battalion of berserkers rather than a depleted company of exhausted raiders. Life on Point 677 is a grueling test of endurance. Supplies are running dangerously low, and water is a precious commodity that must be carried up the steep slopes under fire. The constant shelling fractures the limestone, turning the very ground into deadly shrapnel that shreds uniforms and flesh. Yet, amidst this misery, Jack Churchill remains a pillar of eccentric stoicism. He refuses to take cover during the barrages, often walking along the ridgeline to inspect positions, offering words of encouragement or a scathing critique of a soldier's kit. His apparent immunity to fear acts as a psychological anchor for the young men who are trembling in their dugouts. One particular night, the German pressure intensifies significantly. Determined to dislodge the commandos, they launch a coordinated assault supported by heavy mortars. The explosions walk up the hillside, shattering the silence and illuminating the valley in stroboscopic flashes of violence. The commandos, outnumbered and outgunned, fight with the desperation of men who have nowhere to run. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and the screams of the wounded. In the center of the chaos, Churchill directs the defense, shifting his limited reserves to plug gaps in the line before they can be exploited. He realizes that the Germans are using the cover of the mortar barrage to creep within grenade range. If they get that close, the sheer weight of their numbers will overwhelm the British position. Jack grabs a carbine and rallies his headquarters staff clerks, signalmen, and runners into a makeshift fighting force. He leads them in a countercharge, not away from the danger, but directly into the teeth of the German advance. They scream the commando battle cry, a primal roar that echoes off the canyon walls, startling the attackers who expect the British to be cowering in their holes. The ferocity of this counterattack blunts the German momentum. Confused by the sudden aggression and unable to determine the size of the force hitting them, the enemy infantry falters. In close-quarters combat, the commandos excel, using their knives and fists when ammunition runs dry. The skirmish is brutal and intimate, fought at ranges where men can smell the breath of their opponents. Churchill is in his element, a warrior from a bygone era navigating the industrial slaughter of the 20th century. His leadership turns a potential rout into a stubborn hold, buying precious time for the artillery on the beach to find their range. By the time dawn breaks, the slopes of Point 677 are littered with the debris of war. The Germans have pulled back, leaving their dead on the wire, unable to break the commando line. The exhausted British soldiers slump in their positions, eyes hollow, faces caked in dust and blood. They have held the pass. The beachhead is secure for another day. Churchill walks among them, assessing the cost. He knows that this pace cannot be sustained forever. But he also knows that they have inflicted a psychological wound on the enemy that is far deeper than the physical casualties. The success of the defense at Salerno is not just a matter of tactical positioning, it is a triumph of spirit. The German High Command, in their reports, estimates the strength of the force holding the hills to be much larger than it actually is. They cannot conceive that a single commando unit, armed with light weapons and led by a man with a sword, could stop the advance of panzer grenadiers. This deception, fueled by Churchill's mad tactics, forces the enemy to commit more resources to the sector, relieving pressure on other parts of the Allied line. As the days turn into weeks, the Allied forces slowly grind their way inland, securing Naples and pushing the Germans north. The immediate crisis of the invasion passes, and the commandos are finally rotated off the line for rest and refit. They leave the Dragoni Valley as legends, the black devils who owned the night. Jack Churchill descends from the hills, his uniform tattered, his boots worn through, but his weapons, the sword and the bow, still at his side. He has proven once again that the rules of modern warfare are merely suggestions to a man with enough audacity. However, there is little time for rest. The war in the Mediterranean is shifting. The Allies are looking across the Adriatic Sea to the rugged coast of Yugoslavia, where a different kind of war is being fought. The partisan forces under Josip Broz Tito are engaging deeply entrenched German divisions in a savage guerrilla conflict. The British Special Operations Executive needs experienced commanders to liaise with the partisans and conduct raids on the German-held islands. It is a mission that requires diplomacy, independence, and a high tolerance for chaos, a job description that seems written specifically for Jack Churchill. He receives his orders with a gleam in his eye. Yugoslavia offers a return to the kind of raiding warfare he loves hitting hard, moving fast, and operating behind enemy lines with minimal oversight. He begins to study the maps of the Dalmatian coast, identifying the strategic island of Brač as a key target. The mountains of Italy were a crucible, but the islands of the Adriatic will be a gauntlet. He packs his bagpipes, ensuring the reeds are in working order. He has a feeling he will need them for what comes next. The transfer to the island of Vis, the Allied stronghold in the Adriatic, marks the beginning of the next chapter. Here, the atmosphere is different, wilder, less structured. The partisans are tough, uncompromising fighters who respect strength above all else. Churchill's reputation precedes him, and when he arrives, sword at his hip, he is viewed with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. He sets about organizing a mixed force of British commandos and Yugoslav partisans, preparing for a raid that will be the most ambitious and tragic of his career. As he looks out over the dark waters toward the German-occupied islands, Jack Churchill senses the looming shadow of fate. The luck that has carried him through Dunkirk, Norway, and Italy has been phenomenal. But in war, luck is a finite resource. He sharpens his claymore one last time, the metal singing against the stone. He is ready to bring the music of the highlands to the Balkans, unaware that the melody will soon turn into a lament. The stage is set for the assault on Brač, where the archer will face his final stand, June 2nd, 1944. The island of Brač, Yugoslavia. The midday sun beats down on the limestone karst with a ferocity that rivals the enemy fire, turning the rocky landscape into a shimmering oven of heat and death. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill stands at the base of a formidable objective known simply as Hill 622, the highest point on the island and the key to the German defensive line. His mission is a diversion, a massive raid intended to draw Wehrmacht forces away from Doktvar on the mainland, where the partisan leader Josip Broz Tito is currently surrounded and fighting for his life. It is a suicide mission in all but name, demanding a direct assault against entrenched bunkers. minefields, and barbed wire. The Allied force is a motley collection of British commandos from No. 40 and No. 43 units, fighting alongside nearly 2,000 Yugoslav partisans. The coordination between the two groups is strained by language barriers and conflicting tactical doctrines, creating a friction that is palpable in the humid air. While the partisans are brave guerrilla fighters, they are ill-equipped for a frontal assault against heavy fortifications. As the initial waves of the attack falter under the withering hail of MG-42 machine gun fire, the momentum of the operation begins to crumble. The British commandos find themselves pinned down in the scrub, unable to advance without being cut to pieces by the snipers hidden in the rocky crags above. Jack Churchill watches the stagnation of the battle with growing frustration. He knows that in an assault like this, hesitation is fatal once the infantry goes to ground. It takes a monumental effort to get them moving again. He realizes that standard orders and radio calls will not suffice to break the paralysis of fear gripping the men. He needs to do something drastic, something visible and audible that will shame the enemy and inspire his troops. He reaches for his bagpipes, the set he has carried from Scotland to Norway and Italy, and prepares to orchestrate the deadliest concert of his life. He signals to the remaining men of his headquarters section, a small group of 6 loyal soldiers, to prepare for a final push. With the drone of the pipes rising above the crack of rifle fire, Churchill steps out of cover and begins the climb. He plays the Cameron Men, the same tune that heralded the assault on WWII years earlier. But this time the context is grimly different. There is no surprise here. Only a steep, exposed slope leading directly into the teeth of the German defences. The sound of the bagpipes is surreal, an alien noise in the Adriatic heat that causes both sides to pause momentarily in sheer disbelief. Then, the German gunners recover their wits and concentrate their fire on the lone figure leading the charge. Bullets kick up dust around his feet, yet he continues to march upward, seemingly protected by an invisible shield of audacity. Inspired by their commander's insanity, the surviving commandos of No. 43 rise from the scrub and follow him. They scream their battle cries, charging up the hill in a desperate bid to close the distance before they are annihilated. The partisans on the flanks, seeing the British officer walking through the fire, renew their own efforts, pouring suppressive fire onto the German bunkers. The battle transforms into a chaotic scramble over razor-sharp rocks and through thickets of thorny vegetation. Men fall by the score, their bodies rolling back down the slope. But the advance continues, pulled forward by the hypnotic wail of the pipes and the gleaming sword at Churchill's hip. By the time they reach the saddle of the hill, the commando force has been decimated. The intense mortar fire has shattered their formations, leaving only small pockets of resistance fighting in isolation. Jack reaches the summit, but he looks around to find that he is almost alone. Of the hundreds who started the ascent, only 6 men have made it to the top with him. They dive into a shallow depression, a natural trench in the rock that offers scant protection from the enemy soldiers swarming just a few yards away. The objective has been reached, but they have no reinforcements, no radio contact, and very little ammunition remaining. The situation on the peak of Hill 622 is hopeless. The Germans, realizing that the British force is tiny, begin to close the noose. They maneuver around the flanks of the depression, tossing potato masher grenades into the commando position. One by one, the men with Churchill are killed or severely wounded. The medical officer is hit while trying to bandage a soldier. The radio operator takes a bullet to the chest. The air is thick with the smell of blood, cordite, and the wild sage crushed under the bodies of the fallen. It is a scene of intimate, tragic violence, played out on a lonely mountaintop far from home. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long shadows across the killing ground, Jack Churchill realizes that the end has come. He has fired his revolver dry, his grenades are gone. He is the last man left capable of fighting, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. In this moment of ultimate defeat, he does not surrender, nor does he cower. He lays down his empty weapon and picks up his bagpipes one last time. He stands up in the depression, fully exposed to the enemy, and begins to play. The tune he chooses is Will Ye No Come Back Again, a haunting Scottish lament that speaks of loss, exile, and the longing for a return that may never happen. The sound drifts across the battlefield, a mournful elegy that temporarily silences the German infantry. They stare at the battered, bloody officer standing amidst the carnage, playing music as if he were at a funeral service rather than a combat zone. For a few seconds, the sheer, poignant beauty of the moment holds the violence at bay. The German soldiers are transfixed, witnessing a display of defiance that transcends nationality or politics. It is the final act of the Mad Jack legend, a gesture of supreme contempt for death. But the war is a machine, and it does not pause for poetry for long. A German mortar crew, shaking off the spell, adjusts their sights on the lone figure. They drop a round into the tube, the metallic clunk signaling the end of the recital. The shell arcs through the air and lands directly in the depression, just a few feet from where Churchill is standing. The explosion is deafening, a blast of heat and pressure that lifts him off his feet and slams him against the limestone rock. The bagpipes let out a final, discordant squawk as the airbag is punctured. Darkness rushes in to claim Jack Churchill, silencing the music and ending the battle for the hill. When he regains consciousness, the world is a blur of pain and confusion. His head is throbbing, and his body feels as though it has been put through a meat grinder. He tries to reach for his sword, but his hands are empty. He looks up to see the barrels of German submachine guns pointing at his face. He is not dead, but he is a prisoner. The German soldiers looking down at him are wary. Half expecting this demon to spring up and attack them with his bare hands, they strip him of his remaining equipment, taking the broken bagpipes and the claymore as trophies of war. The realization of his capture hits him harder than the mortar shell. For a man who lived by the code of no surrender, being taken alive is a fate worse than death. He is dragged down the mountain he fought so hard to climb, passing the bodies of the men he led. The Germans are excited. They believe they have captured a high-ranking officer, perhaps even a relative of the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Due to his surname, they treat him with a strange mixture of roughness and curiosity, eager to interrogate the man who fought a modern war with the weapons of antiquity. He is transported to the mainland and then flown to Berlin for interrogation. The intelligence officers are baffled by him. He offers no military secrets, only sarcastic remarks and stoic silence. They ask about the sword, the bow, the pipes. He tells them simply that he is a soldier and that these are his tools. The Germans, obsessed with their own Teutonic myths of warriorhood, find a grudging respect for him. But they also classify him as a dangerous prominente, a high-value prisoner. He is destined not for a standard POW camp, but for Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp where the Third Reich keeps its most special and problematic captives. Inside the walls of Sachsenhausen, the reality of the Nazi regime becomes undeniably clear. This is not a soldier's prison, it is a factory of death. Yet, even here, stripped of his kilt and his weapons, Jack Churchill remains unbroken. His mind immediately turns to escape. He studies the fences, the guard rotations, the soil composition. He makes contact with other high-profile prisoners, forging alliances in the shadow of the gallows. The war is far from over for him. He may have lost his sword, but he still possesses his most dangerous weapon, his indomitable will. As the Allied armies close in on Germany from the east and the west, the tension in the camps rises. The SS guards are becoming increasingly erratic and brutal. Knowing their time is running out, Jack knows that he cannot wait for liberation. He must seize it. He begins to dig, physically and metaphorically, preparing for one last adventure behind the wire. The archer has been caged, but the cage is rusting, and the desire to see the seven-bore again burns brighter than ever in the darkness of his cell. September 1944. Sachsenhausen concentration camp, just north of Berlin. The air here tastes of ash and industrial despair, a stark contrast to the clean mountain air of Yugoslavia where Jack Churchill was captured. He is no longer treated as a standard prisoner of war protected by the Geneva Convention. He has been classified as prominente, a high-value captive held in the Sonderlager A, a special compound isolated from the main camp misery. Here, he finds himself in the company of other notable figures, including survivors of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III and political prisoners like the former Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg. While the conditions are physically better than the general barracks, the psychological pressure is immense, as the SS guards view them not as soldiers, but as bargaining chips for a failing regime. For a man like Jack Churchill, whose entire philosophy is built on action and aggression, confinement is a form of torture. He paces the perimeter of the compound like a caged tiger, his eyes constantly scanning the double rows of electrified barbed wire and the machine gun towers that loom over them. He refuses to be broken by the boredom or the creeping dread that permeates the camp. Instead, he channels his restless energy into a singular purpose: escape. He strikes up a friendship with squadron leader Bertram Jimmy James, a survivor of the Great Escape who shares Jack's unyielding determination to return to the fight. Together, they begin to hatch a plan that is as daring as it is dangerous. The plan involves a tunnel, a classic staple of prisoner escapes, but executing it within the high-security Sonderlager requires nerves of steel. Using nothing but stolen cutlery and rusty tin cans, they begin to excavate a narrow passage from beneath a floorboard in their barracks. The work is grueling and claustrophobic, performed in total silence to avoid alerting the SS guards patrolling just feet away. They dispose of the soil by scattering it in the small garden plot allowed to the prisoners. Mixing the fresh earth with the existing dirt under the cover of casual gardening, every handful of dirt removed is a small victory against the Third Reich, a physical manifestation of their refusal to submit. On the night of September 23, 1944, the tunnel is ready. Under the cover of a moonless sky and a deliberately staged argument among other prisoners to distract the guards, Jack and Jimmy James slip into the hole. They crawl through the suffocating darkness, the smell of damp earth filling their nostrils, until they reach the exit point beyond the outer wire. Emerging into the cool night air, they are free. But they are deep inside Nazi Germany, hundreds of miles from friendly lines. They split up to maximize their chances, with Jack heading north toward the Baltic coast, hoping to stow away on a Swedish ship. For weeks, Jack Churchill navigates the hostile enemy landscape as a fugitive. The weather is turning colder, and he has no proper winter clothing, only his tattered uniform and a stolen coat. He moves only at night, navigating by the stars and the moss on the trees, avoiding the roads which are patrolled by the Gestapo and the Home Guard. He survives on raw vegetables stolen from fields, turnips, carrots, and potatoes gnawing on them while shivering in wet ditches. It is a primal existence, stripped of the glory of battle, yet he endures it with the same stoicism he showed at Dunkirk. He covers nearly 150 miles on foot, a testament to his incredible physical fitness and mental resilience. However, the net is too tight. Near the city of Rostock, just miles from the coast and potential freedom, he is spotted. The authorities are on high alert for escaped prisoners, and he is eventually cornered by a patrol. There is no sword fight this time, no bagpipes, just the cold reality of rifles pointed at an exhausted, starving man. He is recaptured and subjected to intense interrogation. But the Germans, perhaps realizing the futility of breaking him or simply overwhelmed by the collapsing war effort, do not execute him. Instead, he is shackled and sent back into the darkness of the camp system, this time to Flossenburg, and eventually, as the Allies advance, he is moved south. By April 1945, the Third Reich is in its death throes. The roads of Germany are clogged with retreating troops, desperate refugees, and columns of prisoners being marched away from the front lines. Churchill and the other prominente are loaded onto buses and trucks, moving under heavy SS guard toward the Alpine Redoubt in Tyrol. The atmosphere is terrifyingly volatile. The SS guards know the war is lost, and their discipline is fraying into nihilistic violence. Rumors swirl among the prisoners that orders have been issued from Berlin to execute all high-value captives to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The convoy arrives in the picturesque village of Niederdorf in the South Tyrol. The beauty of the snow-capped Dolomites stands in stark contrast to the grim reality of the situation. The prisoners are housed in a local hotel, but the SS guards, led by a fanatical Untersturmführer, are drinking heavily and brandishing their weapons with increasing menace. They set up machine guns in the town square, their barrels trained on the hotel entrance. Jack Churchill, sensing the shift in the air, realizes that their execution is imminent. He rallies the other prisoners, urging them to prepare for a fight. However hopeless it might be, they look for weapons, improvised clubs, anything to defend themselves. In this moment of supreme crisis, a strange twist of fate occurs. One of the prisoners manages to contact a local Wehrmacht unit stationed nearby. The regular German army officers are disillusioned with the war and despise the SS for their brutality and fanaticism. Captain Richard von Alvensleben, a Wehrmacht officer of the old Prussian school, receives the distress call, recognizing that the execution of these prominent prisoners would be a war crime that could hang him and his men after the inevitable surrender. And perhaps motivated by a sense of honor, he decides to intervene. Captain von Alvensleben arrives at the village square with a company of heavily armed infantry. The scene that unfolds is a tense standoff between the two rival branches of the German military. The Wehrmacht soldiers, seasoned veterans of the front, take up positions opposite the SS guards. Alvensleben steps forward, his hand on his holster, and demands that the SS stand down and relinquish control of the prisoners. The SS commander, drunk and belligerent, threatens to open fire. For a few heart-stopping minutes, it seems as though a civil war will erupt in the middle of the village, with Jack Churchill and the others caught in the crossfire. However, the Wehrmacht has brought superior firepower. An anti-tank gun is wheeled around the corner, aimed directly at the SS transport trucks. Faced with the certainty of being blown to pieces by their own countrymen, the SS resolve crumbles. They lower their weapons, sullen and defeated. Under Alvensleben's stern gaze, they are forced to withdraw, leaving the village and the prisoners in the custody of the regular army. It is a bizarre liberation. Jack Churchill is technically still a prisoner of the German Reich, but his captors are now acting as his protectors against the death squads of his enemies. For the next few days, an uneasy truce holds in the valley. The Wehrmacht soldiers guard the hotel, sharing their rations with the prisoners and treating them with a degree of respect that has been absent for years. Jack uses this time to regain his strength, eating whatever food can be scavenged and organizing the prisoners into a cohesive group. The sound of artillery grows louder every day, echoing off the mountain peaks. The Americans are coming. The German soldiers know it. The villagers know it. And Jack Churchill waits with impatient anticipation. The war in Europe is ending, and he has survived the camps, the death marches, and the execution orders. Finally, on May 4th, 1945, the vanguard of the US Fifth Army rolls into the valley. The sight of the white stars on the tanks and the olive-drab uniforms is the sweetest thing the prisoners have ever seen. The German guards surrender without a fight, handing over their weapons to the Americans. Chaos turns into celebration. Cigarettes, chocolate, and rations are distributed, and the prominente are mobbed by soldiers eager to hear their stories. Jack Churchill steps out of the hotel, a free man for the first time in nearly a year. He breathes in the mountain air, no longer tainted by the fear of the SS. But while others are celebrating the end of their ordeal and the coming peace, Jack Churchill's reaction is characteristically different. He feels a restless agitation. He asks the American officers for news of the war. They tell him that Hitler is dead, Berlin has fallen, and the surrender is days away. Instead of relief, a look of frustration crosses Jack's face. He feels that he has missed the climax of the great game. He has spent the last year rotting in a cell, while the greatest battles of history were fought without him. To him, the war is not a tragedy to be escaped, but a profession to be practiced. He immediately begins to petition for a transfer. The war in Europe may be finishing, but he knows there is still fighting in the Far East. The Japanese are still holding out in the Pacific. He tells anyone who will listen that he is fit, ready, and willing to fight. He retrieves what little kit he can find and prepares to leave the Alps. As he looks at the American GIs relaxing and celebrating, he shakes his head. He is a warrior who has lost his war, and he is desperate to find another one before the world settles into an uncomfortable peace. His liberation is merely a logistical hurdle to be cleared. He sets his sights on Burma, on the jungles where the fighting is close and vicious terrain that suits a man with a sword. He does not know yet that the age of the atom is dawning, an era that will render his style of warfare obsolete. For now, he is Mad Jack, the survivor, the unkillable commando, and he is marching towards the sound of the guns, wherever they may be. The final chapter of his military career awaits, not in the snows of Tyrol, but in the heat of the rising sun, May 1945. The European theatre has fallen silent, the guns of the Third Reich silenced by unconditional surrender. For millions of soldiers and civilians across the continent, this is a moment of profound relief, a time to weep for the dead and celebrate the living. But for Jack Churchill, the peace in Europe is merely an administrative inconvenience. While recovering in England, he refuses to settle into the comfortable life of a celebrated veteran. His eyes are fixed firmly on the East, where the British Empire is still locked in a ferocious struggle against Imperial Japan. To him, the war is unfinished business, a job half done that requires his specific set of archaic skills to complete properly. He petitions the War Office relentlessly, demanding a transfer to the Pacific Theatre. His reputation as a fearless commando leader precedes him, and his request is granted. He is assigned to the Burma front, a nightmarish landscape of dense jungle, monsoon rains, and brutal close-quarters combat. It is the perfect environment for a man who prefers the silence of a bow and the reach of a broadsword. He arrives in India, eager to join the push toward the Malay Peninsula. He sharpens his claymore, anticipating the kind of visceral, hand-to-hand fighting that the industrialized slaughter of the Western Front rarely offered. He tells his new unit that the Japanese are a warrior culture who will appreciate being fought with steel. However, history has other plans for the world, plans that do not involve swords or longbows. In August 1945, while Churchill is in India preparing for the invasion of Malaya, the United States Army Air Forces drop atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The sheer, devastating power of these new weapons forces the Japanese Empire to capitulate almost immediately. The war ends not with a final charge or a clash of armies, but with a blinding flash of light and the stroke of a pen. The great global conflict is over. The silence that follows is absolute, ringing across the oceans from Tokyo to London. When the news reaches the British camp in India, the reaction is overwhelmingly jubilant. Men cheer, toss their helmets in the air, and dream of returning to their families. Jack Churchill, however, is despondent. He views the atomic bomb as a cheat, a technological shortcut that robbed the infantry of their final test. In a moment of candid frustration that will become his most famous epitaph, he turns to a fellow officer and growls his displeasure. "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks," he declares, "we could have kept the war going another 10 years. It is a statement of supreme absurdity, yet it perfectly encapsulates his view of war not as a horror, but as a grand, adventurous sport. With the war truly over, Jack faces the most difficult challenge of his life, peace. A warrior without a war is a ghost haunting the living world, and he struggles to find his place in a society rebuilding itself from the rubble. However, the British Army still has need of men who do not fear danger. In 1946, he qualifies as a parachutist, transferring to the Seaforth Highlanders and later the Highland Light Infantry. In 1948, he is posted to British Mandate Palestine. The region is a powder keg of sectarian violence between Jewish and Arab forces, a complex and dirty conflict that lacks the moral clarity of the war against Hitler. In the spring of 1948, as the British prepare to withdraw from the Mandate, the violence escalates. On April 13th, a medical convoy bound for the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus is ambushed by Arab forces in the narrow streets of Sheikh Jarrah. The British military orders are strict, do not intervene. But Jack Churchill is not a man who follows orders when innocent lives are at stake. He is one of the first officers on the scene. Ignoring the hail of bullets striking the pavement around him, he walks into the middle of the kill zone, wearing his full dress uniform, kilt, and Glengarry bonnet. He approaches the beleaguered convoy with a calmness that borders on insanity. He offers to evacuate the civilians in his own armored personnel carrier. When the convoy leaders hesitate, paralyzed by fear and confusion, Jack takes matters into his own hands. He rallies a small group of British soldiers and engages the ambushers, providing covering fire to allow some of the trapped medical staff to escape. While the massacre that follows is a tragedy, 78 people are killed, Churchill's actions save countless others. It is a reminder that beneath the eccentric persona of Mad Jack, there beats the heart of a deeply moral protector who despises the slaughter of the defenseless. Following the end of the mandate and his return from the Middle East, Jack continues to serve, eventually becoming an instructor at the Land Air Warfare School in Australia. It is here that he discovers a new passion that rivals his love for the bagpipes surfing. In the late 1942, surfing is virtually unknown outside of Hawaii and California, but Jack embraces it with the same obsessive dedication he applied to archery. He designs and builds his own surfboards, massive wooden planks that weigh a ton but glide smoothly over the Pacific swells. He becomes a fixture on the Australian coast, a British officer carving waves with a look of pure joy on his face. Upon his return to England in the 1952, he retires from the army. But he does not retire from adventure. He brings his surfboard back to the cold, grey waters of the UK. He becomes the first man to surf the Severn Bore, a tidal wave that sweeps up the River Severn. It is a dangerous and unpredictable phenomenon, a wall of water churning through the muddy river channel, flanked by trees and cows rather than palm trees and sand. Jack rides the Bore for miles, mastering the river with the same focus he once used to stalk sentries in Italy. To the locals watching from the banks, he is a bewildering spectacle, a man conquering nature simply because it is there. His civilian life is filled with the kind of eccentricities that make him a local legend. He settles in Surrey, commuting to London for a job with the Ministry of Defence. Every evening on the train ride home, he performs a ritual that baffles his fellow passengers. As the train rattles past the bottom of his garden, Jack stands up, opens the window, and hurls his briefcase out into the darkness. He then sits back down calmly for the remainder of the journey to the station. When asked why, he explains with perfect logic that the briefcase is heavy, and he sees no reason to carry it all the way from the station when he can simply throw it into his own backyard. He continues to pursue his love of archery, not just as a hobby, but as a lifestyle. He appears in films as an extra, often firing arrows in historical epics like Ivanhoe. He retains his physical fitness well into old age, a striking figure with a silver moustache and piercing eyes that have seen the worst of the 20th century. He never loses his connection to the river, spending his final years messing about in boats on the Thames. He creates intricate radio-controlled models of warships, conducting miniature naval battles on the weekends, perhaps reliving the grand strategies of the past on a manageable scale. As the decades pass, the world changes. The Cold War freezes the map of Europe, men walk on the moon, the digital age begins to dawn. The era of the sword and the longbow fades into the realm of myth. Jack Churchill becomes a living relic, a character from an adventure novel who somehow wandered into the real world and decided to stay. He is often interviewed by journalists who are fascinated by his exploits, but he remains humble about his service. To him, what he did was not extraordinary. It was simply the duty of an officer to lead from the front and to ensure his men were properly motivated, even if that motivation required bagpipes. In 1996, at the age of 89, John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill passes away peacefully at his home in Surrey. There is no gunfire, no roar of battle, just the quiet end of a long and extraordinary life. His death marks the severing of a link to a bygone age of warfare, an age where individual courage and personal flair could still influence the outcome of a skirmish. The news of his passing travels around the world, from the commando associations in Britain to the surf clubs in Australia and the villages in Norway, where he is still remembered as the liberator with the sword. The legacy of Mad Jack is more than just a collection of amusing anecdotes or military records. He represents the human spirit's refusal to be categorized or standardized. In a war dominated by machines, tanks, and bombers, he asserted the primacy of the individual warrior. He proved that a man with a bow could still kill a man with a rifle, that a song could be a weapon, and that a sword could capture a garrison. He was a romantic in a cynical age, a cavalier in a tank regiment, a man who played the game of war by his own rules until the very end. Today, the Royal Norwegian Explorers Club refers to him as one of the finest Englishmen of his time. His longbow and his claymore are museum pieces, silent witnesses to the chaos of Dunkirk and Salerno. But if one listens closely to the wind whistling through the Scottish Highlands, or the roar of the Severn Bore crashing against the riverbanks, one might still hear the faint echo of the Cameron men being played on the pipes. Jack Churchill may be gone, but the legend of the officer who went to war with a bow and arrow will never truly die. He remains the ultimate soldier-poet, the last archer, the man who fought the modern world and, in his own way, won.